and YouTube simultaneously? Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to this evening's program on the book launch of World is Family, written by Dr. Vishakha Desai and brought to you by the Indo-American Arts Council. Our mission within the literary arm of the IAAC is to provide a platform for authors and thought leaders from around the world to share their stories which originate and are shaped by the Indian ethos and experience. These past 18 months will go down in history as some of the most trying times. Yet over and over, we have seen examples where humanity has overcome through the power of unity and found strength through perseverance. In this story, Dr. Vishakha Desai uses her life experiences to explore the significance of living globally and its urgency for our current moment. In fact, it conjures the complexities and exhilaration of a life that is rooted in many places. World is Family is a vital book for everyone or anyone who aspires to connect across borders, real and perceived, and bring to fruition the ideal of a global family. Given the seminal importance of the subject, the IAAC wants to present this book and discuss with leaders who, by their thoughts, deeds, and global social impact, exemplify the ideal that this book articulates. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Amina Akram is the founder and CEO of Uran, a subscription-based book club for children of all ages that exists to bring people closer together through unique stories and shared experiences. Born and raised in Pakistan, Amina moved to the US in 2001, where she has practiced law at some of the most prestigious law firms in the world. Since then, she has lived in several places across the globe, including New York, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, and Houston. For most of her childhood, Amina read whatever limited content was available in her school, the local market, and local library. At 16, in her first act of teenage rebellion, Amina read Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which was banned in Pakistan. From there, she would have friends bring her books from outside Pakistan that shaped her thinking. These stories enabled her to dream beyond the constraints of her society. We are also joined by Ms. Jennifer Acker. Jennifer is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Common, the author of the debut novel, The Limits of the World, a fiction honoree for the Massachusetts Book Award. Her memoir, Fatigue, is a #1 Amazon bestseller. She teaches writing and editing at Amherst College, where she directs the literary publishing internship and LitFest. It is also my pleasure to introduce Ms. Kartika Nair. Kartika is a poet, fabulous librettist whose books include the forthcoming A Different Distance, co-written with poet Marilyn Hacker. Until the Lions, Echoes from Mahabharata, her reimagining of the foundational South Asian epic in multiple voices, won the 2015 Tate Literature Live Award for Book of the Year. It was shortlisted for the Atta Galata Prize and highly commended in the 2016 Forward Prizes. The performances she has scripted and co-scripted for choreographers include Akram Khan, Siddhi Larbi Sharkawi, and Damia Jaleh, have been staged at venues across the world, such as Sadler's Wells, Islande, and Lincoln Center. Also a dance enabler, Nair's closest and longest association has been with Siddhi Larbi Sharkawi as producer and co-founder of Sharkawi Antwerp-based company Eastman. Welcome and thank you for joining our panel for World is Family. I would like to now turn it over to Vice Chairman of the Indo-American Arts Council, Mr. Rakesh Kaul.
Nili, thank you very much for putting together what promises to be a fabulous program. At IAC, we seek books for the ages. And when I encountered World as Family, I realized that this is a book that falls in the rarest of rare categories. World as Family has been around since 500 BC. But to actually find an individual that has lived their life at that highest principle of humanity, I don't know of anyone. So when I read this book, I immediately put it in the same category as Mahatma Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth. But what was especially a matter of great delight is the author, Dr. Vishakha Desai. Vishakha has been a personal friend of mine for 25 years. With what great admiration has the New York community watched her as head of the Asia Society in bringing the world together. She has been a mentor. I had the privilege of collaborating with her in the Arts of Kashmir exhibition at the Asia Society. But I have to say, my admiration has turned into awe. This book, World as Family, 2000 years from now, will be seen in the same league as the Homeric Odysseus. The journey it describes is in the same league. The only difference being this is real life. And when you see young Vishakha, how she navigated her life, blessed with the freedom, the state of Swatantra that her father gave her, and then the brutal honesty of self introspection that her mother equipped her, you realize that that ancient Indian phrase, the variegated plumage of the peacock, resides in her. She has all the colors of the rainbow. And with that, and with the distinguished panelists that have assembled, Amina, Jennifer, Karthika. Amina is based in New York. Jennifer is in Boston. Karthika is in Paris, all jewels in their own worlds. I'm going to start off with my first question. Vishakha, way late in the book, you're in China. And after the civility is over, you get asked a very blunt question. You get asked, who are you? I want you to share with the audience the answer you gave. Then I want you to connect it with what was the moment that in your own mind, this answer you gave connected with this ancient precept, world as family, ultimately to the third moment, when did you decide you wanted to write about your life?
My goodness, you have set me up. First of all, let me say that I'm in awe of the panelists. I am just absolutely thrilled that you and Nili and everybody at IAC have put together this incredible gathering of women. Women, very important. I just want to kind of pause there. And just make sure that I actually not, I don't want to be seen as somebody who's figured it all out. This is an effort. It's a journey. It's a process of one life. But I know this is a kind of experience that many, 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 many millions of people have had. So if this is a voice for many of us who have actually crossed borders or who desire to cross cultures, it is for everybody. And all of us make our own efforts. It's just my own little effort. And I don't know about 200 years, 2000 years, or Gandhiji's My Experiment with Truth, I would not want to put myself into that category. But I do think that each one of us can actually make an effort to have a conscious life with a mindfulness of how we connect to the world. So now your question, a very special question. Indeed, it was right after I was appointed as the president of the Asian Society, but I had not yet taken the reins. And I had decided my first trip, I'd been to China many times, but as the president designate, I would go to China first for the obvious reasons, because the Chinese would wonder what was going to go happen. What I did not actually think is that in the very first luncheon, when we're doing all the niceties, that they would actually ask me that blunt question. This was a former ambassador to Paris, to St. James's Court, spoke English beautifully. And at the end of lunch, she says, I close my eyes and I hear an American. And I open my eyes and I see a completely Indian person. Who are you? And at that moment, I knew the question was literally, how should I peg you? And I thought for a moment, I don't know where it came from, and I write about it in the book. And it just sort of occurred to me that the best thing was a metaphor. And I said, in China, you love metaphors. So let me say, if I were a tree, my roots would be Indian, my branches would be American, and if I were a fruit bearing tree, the fruit could belong anywhere. However, that is only possible in a place like America that actually allows for those multiplicities to come together, something to that effect. And I was with my husband, who was a former president of the Asian Society as well. He was teaching at Beidai at the time. He's across the room. And she kind of smiled, and I don't think the ambassador knew what to do. And we let it go. But I have thought about that it's sort of, in a way, is the essence of what I'm trying to say. And that is that multiplicity within all of us. And it's all kinds of multiplicities. Is Jennifer getting married to a Gujarati from Kenya and comes into your life? It is Kartika in Paris. It is Amina, who has been in Brazil and LA and New York. All of us, and all of us have some kind of multiplicity. We move from one place to another, even if it's within one's own country. And in that multiplicity is the kernel of expansiveness to have the possibility to bring more world into you. And that made me realize is that actually, when I was asked to write a book, and I was thinking about writing about India, and I had all kinds of questions. And then when the publisher said, no, 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 we want you 50 years or more, you lived in America. So we want to know about your life. And I said, well, that's not so interesting. And it was the students that I worked with at Columbia, exchange students that I work with as a chair of American Field Service. We'll talk about that a little bit more afterwards. They are the ones who said, is it really possible to be a global citizen and have locally rooted life? How do you do that? And it was their question. They're my global Sherpas, I call them. And when they asked me, I said, that is the story. How did I get to be so passionate about things global? As a chair of Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, as a senior advisor to Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia in global affairs, is sort of like, and we decide global is part of my Yahoo ID, right? So I've been passionate about this thing for a long time. So it was really to figure out, what was my journey like? How did I get to be that passionate and recognize that I had a lifetime to add these layers from very locally rooted, uh, what would I say, the dawn of independence of India and being in a family of freedom fighters, to be very proud of that history. and then adding on to this. So I recognize that I had a lifetime, I had a luxury. The students today, the Generation Z, they are living in that world simultaneously, local, national, global. The world is in their palm, in their cell phone, in their smartphone. And 50% of young people in the world today have cell phone. So, or the smartphone. So I realized that I needed to figure out how do you live simultaneously in these worlds, which I had the luxury of living over a long period of time. I have to acknowledge that actually I'd come up with the title World as Family Vasudeva Kutumbakam. We have all heard it many times. It's written in the front of the parliament, almost too cliched, right? And I was giving up on that idea. I said, this phrase is too idealistic, it's too general, it sounds a little kumbaya-ish. Let's forget it. COVID happens. And I pretty much finished the draft. I'm about to give it to the publishers. And it occurred to me how brilliant that phrase is. And it's to actually recognize that family as a unit, we all understand. We understand that in a family, at least a functional family, we learn to live as individuals within a unit. We learn our independence in relation to the interdependence of the family. That idea, in a very human level, is completely something we can feel. How do we apply it to the world? And I realized the most important part of that phrase was family, then going to the world. Rather than thinking of the whole world, okay, everybody's cool, that is what made me realize the profundity of that phrase. And I dug down and I said, nope, this is the phrase that I want to use. And so the impetus for writing this book is to really figure out, what does it mean to live like that? How did I get to be so passionate? And it's not a walk in the park or a piece of cake, as somebody would say. It is a lot of work and there's a lot of confusion. And there's a lot of going back and forth, and I write about it in the book, that the truth is, celebrate the messiness, celebrate the liminality. It is not as if you're going to have a black and white answers to these. And you will make mistakes sometimes. But the richness that comes from that is worth the messiness that you live through, the muck that you live through. And climate crisis, the pandemic, all of it reminds us that we can't afford not to think about the world as family. It's urgent because COVID pandemic, they don't know national borders. We know already that the pathogen, the variant that was in India, soon is going to be the preeminent variant here. We don't have the option. As the Secretary General of the UN said, nobody's really safe until everyone is safe. So, how are we going to get there? Each one of us has a role to play. And this book is really my kind of way of thinking about how to play my part in it.
Thank you, Vishakha. That really frames the book, and you beautifully. There's so much to unpack, so I'm just going to turn it over, and maybe Amina, you can kick off, and then Karthika and Jennifer, it's all yours. Go ahead.
Vishakha, it's absolutely delighted to be here and be included in this panel. Totally honored. I want to. This book was so timely for me because I'm at a point in my life where I'm looking at my roots, and what I gained from this book is, there were all moments where like, how did she do it? How did she do it? But also moments where I could completely resonate with your experience. Especially, I think one of the things was that your V's and W's. I remember my first office mate, Christine, fixing my V's and my W's. But going back to my home country, getting my strength from there, my roots, recharging, and then coming here and standing as a trunk, and unwaverably, like I can take anything. But then again, running back, recharging and coming back. So saying that home, that family for a long time, I think the first part of my career was just doing that. So now when I look at my raising a family here, I have two children, 13 and 7. The question is posed amongst my Brazilian friends, my Indian friends, my Pakistani friends. How do we instill that strength in our kids when they're so, as you said, living in a very fast-paced world where the psychological and physical sense of home is is um, is just so diffused, right? How do we bring that sense of rootedness in our children who are such global citizens? Because I feel like, in my experience, the home was my strength, my courage, and then that to help me come into my own. And there's a second part, go in and make an impact in the world, the profession I'm in. And so I'd love to elaborate. I would have you
Yeah.
elaborate on this psychological, physical sense of home and how we instill that in today's child.
I think that that is actually one of the questions that the students are asking, because so many students in the Global Thought MA program come with very many different cultures. They come from different parts of the world. They also embody, for example, an Iranian origin student whose grandmother lives in Germany and he lives in Italy. He is Italian by birth, right? So, in a way, it's like your kinds of kids. I think that the important thing is what I at least learned from my family is that even though my experience was very rooted in Ahmedabad, in India, my parents, especially my father, constantly encourage us to explore other parts of the world in books, in things we read, guests who could come to our house, and other parts of India as well. So you would be very happy to know that he's a journalist. In the early 50s, he had journalists from Pakistan of Gujarati papers coming to our house, and they would actually think about Gujarati poetry. So the idea was that it was the kernel of an idea of exploring world around you as much as having comfort of the rootedness. And I think that for young people today, you have to give them a sense of rootedness in your family. You
Right.
can't expect them to connect back to India, to Pakistan, to Brazil the same way that you would, because it's not possible for them. But how do you create a sense within them that no matter where they are, there is a comfort level within themselves and explore others without judgment, without boxing people into places. And I think that it's those kinds of values that actually can help them feel comfortable no matter where they are. As Ryder Pico Iyer, who I quote in the book, says, that it isn't always about the piece of soil, it is the piece of soul that you can take no matter where you are and how you can get there. So part of it is to make them feel comfortable in that messiness. They won't have the same kind of roots as you would, but to feel comfortable in
Right.
both parts of those worlds. So, I mean, since I don't have children, but I have lots of siblings and they have kids. And that's one of the things we talk about, where some of my nephews and nieces are deeply connected to India, but some of them are sort of connected, but it's not their country. Their country is the US. This is
Right.
where they feel comfortable, and it's perfectly okay. But have them feel comfortable with many different kinds of people.
Right.
So somebody asked me the other day, and I said, if I were to say how for parents, I did a blog for parents, right? And so how do you raise kids to think about world as family? And I kept saying, what books are you reading to them? What films are you reading, showing them? What communities are you connecting to them? Especially in America, we have the privilege of having the whole world come here. But are we actually engaging with that world to make them as part of our family? And those are the things that will really outlast anything else you would do, because if you force them to go to Pakistan, although
Right.
I have learned from my siblings that they insisted that every year or 2 years, everybody had to go. Part of the family show up. That
Right.
was it. And I think that's part of the family too. You show up.
Right. But
And
also
then,
what you were saying yesterday, Vishaka, when I was talking about the strength that we derive, right, from family. So last night I posed this question while tucking my daughter in. What's home to you? And you know what she said? She said, my home is my soccer field. And I said, really? Why? What do you get from that? From your soccer? She said, I get my courage. I get my strength. It completely blew me away.
there you go. And that's perfectly fine, right? I mean, there's a kind of a place thing that I know, Jennifer, you and I have talked about, and in that, how do you deal with the sense of place while you're thinking about this kind of murkiness of belonging, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll follow up on that and just push this question of place a little bit further, because it is something that I think about all the time for the Common and the pieces that I edit and publish there. I was struck by the sentence in your book, the idea of belonging need not be place-based. And you say, like ideas, people can also find their footing in multiple settings. And so, thinking about that, I wanted to sort of ask you, what kinds of sort of non-places have you found your home? And what kinds of ideas mean home to you, or what kinds of institutions or communities? If you could tell us a little bit about those non-place-based
Right.
belongings.
And at the same time, I mean, I do think that I'm extremely blessed that I had the first 16, 17 years of my life were very rooted in a home that still is a home in Ahmedabad, right? 38 Javanagar will always be a home, even though now it's a home with a little bit of a smaller H, not a capital H.
Mhm.
That's how I think about it. But then, having come to America as an exchange student at the age of 17, and this is more than 50 years ago, when the immigration law had just passed in 65. So there were hardly any Indians. And I lived with an American family. And actually, that idea that strangers can become part of my family, and therefore the place I was in was another kind of home that I developed. So that actually made me realize that there's all kinds of ways that you think of belonging and home. And how do those two come together? It's not the same, I understand that. But there is something about feeling at home that makes a difference, right? So for me, partly it was actually nowadays, it's various communities where I feel very much at home. So the AFS family, for example, American Field Service, this crazy program that started with ambulance drivers, 21-year-olds, World War II, and they were picking up dead bodies no matter whose and helping them and helping with the first aid people, right? And they come home and they say, we have seen the horrors. How do we stop these wars? And they start a high school exchange program. Now, whoever thought that that would make a difference? And guess what? They created a sense of movement. So I go to Ghana, I go to Yugoslavia, I meet people. And when the minute we say we were AFSers, there is this whole sense of family that comes together. And therefore, there is a sense of, I find my home, as Amina's daughter said, and soccer field. Sometimes my home is in that community where people come from diversity of backgrounds and we just immediately share that 17-year-old experience somewhere away from home that actually became our home. And so that's another kind of home. I think I've talked to lots of people who, like the third culture kids, who have gone from one place to another, and they're always talking about not just friends, but books, music they listen to, how they actually recreate a sense of home through those kinds of things. And therefore, a place is a physical place, but it is embodied and imbued with things that bring the sense of home to them. And that I think is very interesting. And I actually recognize, for refugees, for so many people who live in semi-permanent places for a long time, how do they create a sense of that belonging and home? It's often through experiences and people and things that they carry. So it's mobility rather than physicalness that I think is also part of that sense of belonging. And because of the students I talk to, I'm just very interested in how they think about it, And they're always also say, as I quote Niels, is that they're always searching because they're at that point in life where they haven't quite made peace with that. But I see how they're trying to figure that out. It's very beautiful. Thank you.
Vishakha, one of the things that you said was about, these the universal truths, but through shared experiences. And one of the examples I saw was how you connected with the Reed family, because there was some similar psychographic coming from the house in Ahmedabad, even though the lifestyle was different. It was more of a collective in Ahmedabad, but you connected really well with them because of your psychographic. And yet when you get married and you go to another family and their second American family, there was not that profound a connection. And
Right.
and I mean and this kind of makes me believe that there is something very powerful about these universal truths that we live, but through shared experiences, right? That's what we say in Uran, that how books do that. But
Right.
I see it a living example in you do that. So if you could elaborate a little bit on this, like universal truths living through shared.
I have to say that it took me a while to figure out those differences. And it was actually as I began to reflect on those experiences. So my first American family, the Reed family that I talk about, I lived with them both in Sagaponic in the South Fork of Long Island, and then in Santa Barbara. I realized, as some of my other colleagues would say, yeah, you didn't get it so bad, it's two different places, going back to the physical home, as it were. But what we shared were the values. That in fact the Reed family was politically engaged, more on the progressive side, and they actually cared about how you think, what you read, how you come together. So it was more of an intellectual family. And my family in India was both intellectual and social activist family. So we shared the values. When I go to the family in Cleveland with my first husband, who was a Peace Corps worker, and he had some of those values, but his family didn't. And therefore, I realized that part of it was class. And I have to own that I was used to not a privileged class, but at least an intellectual class. And that felt comfortable to me. And it was easy to go across multiple thousands of miles and be part of that family. And then when I came back as a 21-year-old, it was harder because their values were not the same. And of course, my former husband also came of age in the late 60s, as did I when I went to Santa Barbara. And that had created that friction between parents and kids that was very palpable. And I was just right in the center, smack in the middle of that tension as to what was America in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think that at the same time, the grandmother in that family just completely embraced me. She wasn't necessarily educated, but her love and her care actually completely bridged all the other fissures that might be there. And that's also something to learn, that love comes in many different directions, even if some values may be divergent, but whether you let them come in your way of making divisions or you actually bridge beyond that. And that was a big lesson too.
Right. Very interesting.
Yes, your book is a very powerful reminder for me over and over of the fact that there are various ways of belonging and various ways of being estranged, even in one's own, what would be perceived as one's own home. Because one of the really moving passages is when you describe that, the welcome that you got from the Reed family, the way you bridged your differences, whether they were dietary or about space. And how much more actually alienated you felt at Elphinstone College in Bombay on going back. So home is so much more perhaps about people than place.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting juxtaposition that you bring up. And I think it's also your expectation, right? So that when you go to a foreign country, you're in a foreign family, everybody's making an effort. And then when I'm in Bombay, after having spent a year in the States and going back to Ahmedabad and thinking that Bombay was going to be a panacea for me intellectually, and I expected that. And I was not prepared for going back to the neo-colonial mindset of the Elphinstone College. I mean, and the whole Bombay intelligentsia in a very different kind of a place. And I think that partly it's not just the people, but it's the context in which you find yourself and your expectation. And so I felt when I went to Bombay, my English was already more Americanized rather than Pakka British English of the Mumbai intelligentsia, you know. And I was just reading Amit Chaudhry's book on Raga, and he talks about how actually all of people like me would be called the vernaculars, vernac, right? They came from the provincial languages. And indeed, I went to Sharda Mandir, that was a Gujarati medium school, not an English medium school, but a very Gandhian and a proud school. So I thought whole of India would be sort of like that. Well, guess what? Not really. So in Mumbai, you go there, and if you didn't speak, the perfect Oxford and Cambridge accent, you were nobody. And then I didn't speak like a moneyman, you know, Gujarati girl. And so they didn't know what to do with me. And as a result, there was always this pressure of saying, you mean you went to America, not to England? Because, yeah, if you were an engineer, okay, you could go to America, but not if you're a liberal arts student. I mean, really, there's just no culture in America. This was the mentality in the 1960s and even in 1968 by that time. So that kind of a folk, and I was too young, I didn't know. And so I was really more unhappy in Mumbai in some ways. And I think that partly when I met my Peace Corps worker husband to be, I found a home in him, right? Because he understood what I had gone through, what Vietnam War was like, the conversations that I could have. And therefore, it was a different kind of relationship. And so I think part of it is the context. So, one thing in the book I do try to do a lot is to see myself in the broader context of what's going on, the big currents, and how I am part of it or how it affects me. And I think that it's worth thinking about why comfort level is not just up to you, it's also how others perceive you. And the identity is not just about you, it's also how people perceive you. And how do you negotiate the discrepancy that occurs, what you think of yourself and how others think of you. And that's a fissure tension, but then can you negotiate that and move forward? You know, that was sort of one of the things that comes out of that question, Kartika. And I would love to know, because you've been a dancer, you've been trained, you've been a poet, and many of the things that you come together. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the kind of the creative pursuits or the role of arts in this journey of capacious belonging, uh, which you've done just an amazing. I looked at your work last night and just fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So how do you do that?
Thank you. I'm actually not a dancer. I'm a dance enabler. So I trained as a dance producer, and I also write dance, which is one of the minor and till recently unknown professions where I actually like librettos. I script dance.
Right.
And again, there was so many things in the book which made me smile in recognition and gratitude. Because one of the things you do is again and again evoke the transformative power of art. it has, I think, in both our lives been just such a bridge builder and a door opener and just a miracle, actually.
Right.
And I think of how, for instance, you talk about how whether it's in Santa Barbara or later in Cleveland, it's the art, it's the dance, it's that connection that you had, it's the upbringing you had, and the fact that you were seeped in both dance and visual art, and therefore the cusp of the performative and the still or the visual art world that actually changed your life. And it's been similar for me, because art also helped me to transcend what is a physical disability. All of which kind of brings me back to something beautiful you say, and which is unfortunately true even today, where you say, ironically, my all-encompassing engagement with Indian art could not have happened in India. And in
So
many ways, it's still true. I mean, not Indian art, things have changed, but for instance, even today, we don't have art management offered as a university, offered in university curriculum. That perception that art is something you do when you cannot do anything else, or is never is an upper class or an elite
right.
occupation, which is not remunerative, which cannot be your achieved identity, continues to a large extent.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about a lot is that during the independence movement, at least as I understand it from my parents and having read it and studied it, is that the movement was as much about political independence as social changes and reclaiming of arts in India as part of a social national fabric. And then independence happens. And what I feel happened was that the political and the economic part of the independence movement got picked up by the government. The arts were paid lip service, but actually not recognized as the third important pillar of the society. And as a result, this kind of, I mean, pardon the expression, Rakesh, because I know you're the IIT type guy, but the truth is, it took you a while to get back into the other part of the world, and now you're a writer too. But the reality is that the privileging of science and it's sort of the kind of mentality that the only way the country could become modern was all through hard sciences and engineering and medical profession. And how many of us, I know it happened to me, I was very good at math and very good at sciences. And my school teachers were like aghast that I wouldn't go into sciences. I didn't want to do that. And thank God for my parents. And they said, no, absolutely, whatever she wants to do, that's what she's going to do. But that idea of deprivileging of arts as important part of the society, actually we suffer because when I was going to graduate school in art history, there was only one place where you could do art history, sort of, in India. Today, it's a little bit better, but not much better. And I think that the fact that there were more people studying ancient Indian art, art history in the West, especially in America and in the UK, really says something that you couldn't do that in India. Bharatanatyam, yes, you could do that in India. It was not taught actually as a university degree, right? Except in Mumbai University that actually started doing that in the 1970s, much later. And it took a long time. Miniature painting, never taught in any of the India universities. In Lahore, at the National College of Art, they started doing that because it was actually owning that the miniature painting could be the part of the Mughal tradition that you could own in some ways. And the rest is history with people like Shazia Sikandar and Imran and other people. So the point I'm making is that I think there is something about art and nationalism that kind of is one set of questions. Then there is art as expression that what Azar Nafisi, the Iranian American writer, calls the Republic of Imagination. And I grew up in a family where my father used to say that He was so happy that he was in British jails from time to time because he was imprisoned all the time, sometimes in solitary, but they allowed books. And he said, right there, sitting in those jail cells, he could read books from everywhere. And so he read about Lenin, and at the age of 27 wrote the first biography of Lenin in Gujarati. I don't know who read it, but he wrote it. Uh, and the point is that it therefore gave me a sense, and I was a big reader. I read lots of Bengali books translated in Gujarati and other things, not English books, because that was not what I read, but Gujarati was something I read a lot. And as a result, and I was a dancer very early on, it opened the world for me to see the possibility, which goes back to the Cleveland Museum experience that I write about, to work with African American kids in East Cleveland public schools who came to me at the Cleveland Museum. And initially, they didn't even know who I was, where India was, or anything else. You have to read the book to read about it. But the truth is that as we came in front of the dancing Shiva, Shiva Nataraja, 11th century amazing piece, and we started taking the poses and working out together. 6 weeks later, these sculptures were their friends. They talked to them, they wrote stories about them, and they made dances to honor me to go with the dancing Shiva. So the point is that art has that capacity to be of a place, of a time, and transcend that place and time to connect. So today, and I know Rakesh, you're very involved with it, we talk about it, the whole notion of repatriation becomes a big issue as to who owns something. And I worry a little bit that when we talk about who owns what, obviously we have to make historical wrongs right. I understand that. But in that process, if we lose the other inherent power of art to connect across cultures, we would be poorer for it. So I often say that, we shouldn't just fight about Indian objects going back to India. We should fight about having Egyptian objects and having impressionist pictures and having things. So the power of art should be access to different kinds of art. Who gets to see it? So change the conversation a little bit. Otherwise, we might have 500 more objects, 5,000 more objects, 50,000 more objects, and they'll stay in the storages in India, which they do, and nobody gets to see it. What good is that? Let's actually open up the possibility of art objects, visual art, performing arts, books, whatever you have, to make it available in a wider way. So the question is access to cultural diversity, not so much who owns something. Because don't peg the object into little boxes, just as much as don't peg people into boxes. And that's partly why art becomes an important metaphor for me to think about globality, is that multiplicity that art can do, that it doesn't it defies singular categorization, that is so appealing about all forms of art to me, and why we need it, and why the Greeks understood that. They made a distinction between doing and making. And that making is the part of the imagination. And I hope that it comes back into our life. So that's why I'm a big proponent of STEAM rather than STEM. Just make sure arts is part of that, as we go forward. So that's kind of like a whole other conversation. But I feel that in this global conversation, arts play a very important role.
Vishakha, I would love to ask you more about your museum time and in all the time that you spent in museums. I guess it's a two-part question. One is, what did you learn about yourself from working in American museums, and how should those of us who are not visual artists approach museums? How should we use them? How should we look to experience them to get to learn the most and to be the most expansive?
That's such a good question. Something I've been thinking about for 40 years, right? Starting at the age of 21, when I was privileged to get my very first job at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which happened to have one of the best collections of Asian art. So I didn't know that, but it just so happened, right? So that's pretty amazing. I would say the things that I learned about myself was with that experience with these East Cleveland public school kids, African American kids. And that was that interactivity has to be an important part of experience, especially for people for whom this is a very strange world. It is not part of their world. And it has to be sustained. So you can't do just one of those tours, take kids to the tour and then they go out. If it's very passive, it'll remain passive. And what I learned about that is the potential of objects and potential of museums as social institutions in which people from different cultures and connections can happen. And then as I went on in my career, also recognizing that that was of a particular moment. It came from late 60s civil rights struggle, early 70s museums wanted to change. By 80s, museums became much more corporatized, and it was all about money and numbers of different sorts. How many people clicking, coming into the museum? It was not about the experience. And that was when I had a kind of a question whether I wanted to stay in the museum world. And I was thinking, no, I'm going to go away, go to the academy and work with kids, and especially in a public university like UMass, that would help me connect with that passion of connecting cultures. But I realized that I think what has happened is that the museums became too much about this kind of white cube, contactless, contextless object as the masterpiece. And it kind of went to that elite sort of an idea of art, not just art as an experience that you can also have. So, what we're seeing now politically in the museum world is people are fighting back. They are saying, wait a minute, what kind of institution is this? It's not for me. Who should be part of this? So I would say that what I've learned is that power of objects is really profound, but it has to be animated. In a way, it's like the image of a Hindu deity. It is not without darshana, that to see and to be seen is an active process. It needs to have that idea of interaction between object and a viewer that the museums have the obligations to do, and how we do it. So I was just in Boston, and I don't know if you've seen the Basquiat show, but what they have done at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is that they actually have labels that's kind of called the table conversation. So in addition to the curatorial voice, they actually have voices of people who have come together to respond and reflect on the same work. Some African American poets, writers, other people who are coming in. What it does do is to give you another voice, another avenue. And interpretation with multiple voices is really useful. Now, the danger is that then it'll become too word oriented, and what you do with the objectness of object. But with cell phones and other things, there are many different ways that you can do that. So, as a viewer, I would always say, ask yourself, who's doing the talking? And I am a big proponent of having names on the text panels. So it's a person writing that, it's their particular point of view, rather than this voice of God, museums, the big institution. So ask the questions. Who is it for? What are they trying to say? What is a particular point of view? And that makes you as an active viewer And then things you like. Why do you like it? What is going on there? And what is it that you would want to know more? Today, we find out that more than 50% of the viewers going into the museum actually do the homework online beforehand. And that is an interesting kind of a development, so that people are going in with a certain sense of what they want to see, how they want to see it, what they want to know, and how to make it possible. So museums are at an inflection point, I think, right now. Uh, is it going to change dramatically? But sprouts are there of multiple interpretations, multiple access points to the objects. Great question. You know, I'm passionate about this, so I could go on forever. Yeah. Thank you. So we now, where are we? And any other thoughts, comments, observations? I would love to hear from any one of you.
Um, yes, actually, I mean, this book is, thank you, first of all, for writing it. I mean, it's not just lip service, it's just such an unusual book in so many ways. Not the least of which is the awareness you have at each moment and the honesty of being in the moment when you're, say a child and learning Bharatanatyam and overwhelmed by this narrative of this 2,000-year-old tradition, and the capacity to look back from your today's self or your later learned self and know also and share with us the fact that a lot of it is fabricated, and that there is, like you said, there is the national or the political interest in framing art in a certain way. And then there's the experience, there's the capacity for wonder, which you never lose and which you keep sharing with us. That was extraordinary. And
Yeah.
the other two things which struck me about the book, one, how it celebrates serendipity, which we don't credit enough, and you do constantly. We are where we are because of our efforts, but also because of the meetings, the encounters, the kindnesses, and you also chronicle all these kindnesses. And I was just wondering if you could, if at the drop of a hat, if you could tell us about a few moments of wonder or kindness that stay with you.
Right. Such a good question too, Karthika. I mean, I think that there are so many moments, but the things that really stand out for me is actually my very first experience of coming to America and being with the Reed family. And I chronicled this particular moment when I was a complete vegetarian, didn't have eggs or anything. And in America in 1966, vegetarian meant that you ate seafood. You just didn't eat meat. And so we come to Sagaponack in Southampton, and then, at South Fork and Long Island, and they want to buy these creatures. And I thought it was for a fish tank because I'd never seen anything like that. It turned out to be lobster, and it was going to be for us to eat that night. And for me to actually recognize what was I going to do? I mean, I had never seen anything like this in my life. And then slowly coming to terms with the fact that if they came to my house and didn't eat anything that my family cooked, what would that feel like? And for me, that was like this light bulb went off. And I realized later on that was the first lesson in empathy, which is absolutely crucial in anything to do with cross cultural learning and opening up yourself to put yourself in other person's shoes. I didn't know, but that's what I did. And then for my American family to say, oh dear, I finally eat this, I tell them, and they say, okay, so tomorrow you cook your meal. Now, that's a very generous thing to say. Never mind that I didn't know how to cook, but that was a different matter. But that idea that they would say, "Oh, you went through this. Let us learn from that." It's just such a generous thing to do. It's those kinds of moments, or this dance thing that happened at the Cleveland Museum, and the young kids, when I said, "Can you guess where I'm from or who am I?" and complete blank, and I said, "I'm Indian," and they immediately said, "Oh, what kind of Indian? Navajo, Hopi, whatever." And then this little girl stands up and says, when I tell them that, Columbus came and he made a mistake and blah, 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 and that therefore he called them Indians. And how profound that this young girl says, that was hundreds and thousands of years ago, and we still call them Indians? Like, why? And that makes you realize that it's those questions that you say, all you have to do is ask a question. And then you recognize that later on, in 1966, nobody ever thought. I mean, I remember being told that I was East Indian, so they qualified me. But Native Indians, Native Americans were called the real Indians. It was like completely mind-boggling. But it was that kind of a moment where you say, how do we question without value judgment, but also learn from that? I mean, you learn things from so many different places. And then the last one of the aha moment was really not last, but there one of the other ones that I think I want to share is my mother, who, when I met my now current husband, after lots of other kinds of ups and downs, and I wanted to have children. And I was already 40 years old. And my mother, who didn't get married till she was 31, and but had been committed that if the marriage didn't work, she was going to be single and she was going to devote her life to women's work, etc. And she says to me, and then she proceeds to have 7 kids, right? So from 31 to 15 years, she just did it, and committed her life to that, along with working a little bit on the outside. Anyway, and she says, look, not everybody's put on this earth for the same things. And lots of people can have children. But you and Bob, my current husband, and said, you both are doing something for the world. He's a China scholar. I do India. He was former president of the Air Society. I was part of that whole work about education, about that part of the world in America. And she said, you have a partnership. You're making a difference. It is not that important that you also have children and you have nephews and nieces and you make them your own, but also other young people. And the zinger was, she said, if this was that important to you, you would have led your life differently. And then I had to kind of like say, okay, I better own my decisions. And it's those kinds of things that it comes at different moments in time. And yet she was the one, when I got married at the age of 21 the first time, had just said to me, don't forget, marriage is a comma, not a period at the end of a sentence. There is a life before and life after, and they need to be connected. And I mean, I didn't understand it at the age of 19 when I first talked about it, but I realized how profound that is. That know yourself before you go into it and think of it as a comma, especially for women. It's just such an important piece. So I am privileged to have wisdom, but also honesty that you have to kind of own your decisions. So it's pretty cool.
Vishakha, the moment I knew that this book, which had started off as a good book, would be a great book, was when I read that one magical sentence. And that one magical sentence was, I had lost my moorings. Whether it's the Vedas, whether it's Shankaracharya, whether it's Meera, whether it's Laleshwari, whether it's Amir Khusro who says that when you swim in the current of love, he who tries to control it drowns. He who drowns crosses over. So that moment when you realize that you lost your moorings was the moment of grand liberation, and I knew this book would be a great book. The stories that are in this book, oh my, the laughter story had me laughing so hard. But look at what it ended up in terms of the reciprocal action it triggered. It's just been amazing. It's just been amazing, this program. Lily, do you want to wrap it up for us?
Thank you, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. On behalf of the Indo-American Arts Council, I'd like to thank Karthika, Amina, Jennifer for being part of this evening's conversation. Dr. Desai, thank you for this fascinating and insightful conversation. Patrons, supporters at home who want to read World is Family, and when I tell you that the stories, the antidotes, you will not put this book down. It is found on Amazon. I want to officially conclude the moderated portion of this evening's session, but do not sign off because now we will move on to a Facebook Live session where we open up the panel again for our audiences at home. Thank you so much to everyone, and please do keep supporting us. Thank you.
And may I just say thank you so very much to the AIC, but the panelists. And I want to meet you, have more conversations because we have just begun, because you are all formidable in your own right. And what a joy and an honor it is to have had this chance to have some part of the conversation and let it continue. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rakesh, as well.
Thank you, Vishakha. And now we'll open the floor. As Nili said, I will read out the questions and we will continue the conversation a little bit more. And now you have 3 new friends. You get to fly to Paris to meet Karthika. You get to go to Boston, your own happy hunting ground where Jennifer will meet you. But when it comes to Amina, you and I are traveling together to Pakistan. So
Yes, certainly. My
thank you
pleasure.
all. Vishakha, I already have questions piling up here for you. But I have to say, for the first time in a long time, as I was part of and I was listening to you and the panelists, for the first time I felt that I was seeing a Bill Moyers kind of a deep conversation. Weren't the panelists extraordinary?
Amazing. That's the biggest compliment you could give to the program, not so much to me, but to the program, because only thing I wish that there was a lot more time because they have so much to offer as well.
Yeah. So your first question. This is from Dharti Desai, and she expands on Amina's daughter's statement, where she said, "My home is the soccer field." So Dharti Desai has this question for you, Vishakha. I'll read it out slowly. If home is no longer a place where one lives, and is instead what lives inside us, what or who lives inside Vishakha?
Brilliant. And that actually comes from also one of the quotes that I use in the book. So thank you, Dharti. Who lives inside Vishakha? I think all of us have multiple selves. There is, in fact, a part of me that is the child that grew up in Ahmedabad as a third child in a family of 7 kids. Um, and there's my nickname associated with that I really think about a lot because that continues to live. It doesn't go away. Then there is, in fact, that Vishakha that was very much on her own in the 20s and trying to make her way into this country. Um, some of it not easy, but also really absolutely blessed to have had the opportunities. And now there is also Vishakha the dancer who can't dance anymore very much. But there is also there are parts of family that come together, especially my parents. They seem to loom very large inside me. Um, and there is in fact the reflective Vishakha, which comes up in the book, but also is becoming more and more important to me because I feel that our world is moving too fast, or at least so fast that we have no time for reflection about ourselves, about the circumstances we are in, about the world we live in. If anything, COVID teaches us that we better, when we are not going around and flying about everywhere, that we can at least spend the time with ourselves to ask ourselves, what is it that makes us who we are? And at the same time, I will say that there's a wanderlust in me. So there's that Vishakha too, and that I am itching to go out there and look at wonderful places and travel and meet lots of people, but keeping it in some kind of a balance. So there is, like all of us, the truth is, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said, can you actually acknowledge that there are many parts to us and own them and give them space? Because sometimes we don't take the time to give space to the younger us, the playful us, the thoughtful us, and the activists. So I hope that is an answer.
That's a great answer. There are many Vishakhas, as you have shared with us. But what was striking in this book is the honest Vishakha. Spouses talk about their ex-husbands, but nobody writes about their current husband in the way you did. And so the question is this, Vishakha. Robert, in 2005, wrote a book, A Fractured Mind, My Life with Multiple Personality Disorder. How much did Robert shape the brutal honesty with which you have written this book?
He actually is also brutally honest about himself and in the book. So to some extent, when you have a partner who is also brutally honest, it both gives you permission, but it also demands of you that you too actually ask those questions. And I will say that the things that I've learned from him are not just honesty, but also vulnerability. Because with honesty comes a certain level of vulnerability. And I will say honestly, as I say in the book too, is that I got very used to taking care of myself. Having come to America at the age of 17 and then pretty much not ever really living at home again. And it served me well professionally to be self-sufficient, to be able to do what I needed to do. But I recognize that in personal life, if you can't actually access your own vulnerability, you won't be able to have an honest relationship. Mm. And that is something I learned from him. And it's something that I continue to work on because I think it's very important.
Well, one can see that he has shaped the honest Vishakha, the author.
Well, it's not just that he shaped it. I will say that that's something I also got from my parents.
From my parents.
Both of them, absolute clarity around that sense of honesty and clarity around anything artificial was not something that was very acceptable, without making big, huge judgments. And some of that is in the book as well. And I would say that therefore that honesty in life was there, but self-honesty and openness that allows to bring the vulnerability out, that's a different question.
Okay. So Sapna Wadhwani has several questions. And even though you said you made a conscious decision not to have children, she wants you to give advice on how she should raise her teenage daughters. And she asked the question, she says, I think she has twins. My daughters have more American in them than they have Indian. And what should we as parents do so that they can, A, reconcile, and B, embrace both aspects? Now, in your book, you talk about your nieces and nephews who fall into that same milieu. What advice would you give? What would be the 2 or 3 things you would say?
Well, I mean, somehow this has become very common. And I always say that not having been a parent, take my advice with a grain of salt, because I haven't done that. However, it is something that I think about a lot because I work with lots of young people, and also because I see what my nephews and nieces all around me are. And I think the things that we talk about and have talked about also in my family is that the first thing is to, as a parent, do you give space to your kids to kind of feel comfortable even when they're confused? And they will be confused at times. And the only other thing I would say is that to actually push them hard on the Indianness of things, the way we grew up back in India, is not going to work. And I think that most of us know that. But at the same time, and maybe by the time they're teenagers, it may be a little late. But one of the things that I have seen, at least, is that to have them be familiar with things Indian and Indian culture and travel when they're young, and just really spend the time. Because sometimes I've seen in some families where they haven't taken their kids for 6, 7 years. Then you take them, then they don't have any sense of what that's like. Whereas I recognize in my own family is that my sister, who insisted that they were taking kids every 2 years, and when the kids were 2 years old and 3 years old and 5 years old, and they had to deal with all of that. By the time they were 12 and 13 and 14, they may not have wanted to go, but they went because they had friends, because they had family, they had relatives that they could talk to. But one other thing I would say is that what are the kind of conversations you can have? If it feels very forced, it's not going to work. But what about books that they might want to read? Not so much the Ramayana, Mahabharata, all of that stuff, but Amitav Ghosh, some wonderful writers who are very well recognized in this country. And then by the time they go to college, and I've seen this at Columbia and elsewhere too, that kids themselves take classes. So see if there are universities that offer some things in Asian or Indian traditions or what have you. But ultimately, they have to find their own path. And the only thing you can do is to see if you have given them the tools to create their path. Because one thing I will say is that a lot of young Korean American, Indian American kids They grow up, they thinking they're completely American, and then they hit the ground and they are actually perceived as not American enough because the kind of racism that exists in this country comes back to haunt you sometimes. And if you're not prepared to feel ownership and pride in the way who you are and the way you look, it'll be hard for you later on. So some way you have to create a sense of pride in who they are and what they look, because they have to be prepared for other people perceiving them as different from what they think they are.
That's very well said.
Yeah.
So let's move now to Vinita Kapoor's question, which, it's the gorilla in the room. You start off by, I think it's in the foreword or in the very beginning of the book, you start off with the quotation that in 1000 BC, you give the quotation, I think, out of the Upanishad, for the magnanimous, the world alone is family. But when one looks from 1000 BC to today, it seems that the not so magnanimous, the ones that don't believe that the world is a family, seem to be winning. And Vinita Kapoor's question is very specific. She is very, very specific in her question. She says, how do you take what we're talking about and apply it to America versus Ayatollah Khomeini? When, from Khomeini's point of view, the American worldview is very threatening to the culture that he represents, to their desire not to be overpowered by other values. So how do you take this precept of world as a family and make it work and make it succeed and make it a common belief, whether it's Ayatollah Khomeini or whether it's America or anybody else? Why has this precept not won?
Not worked. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, which is one of the reasons why I almost gave up on the title. Because in the last 4 years, what was going on in this country, and I dare say what was going on even in other parts of the world, including India, made me feel like, my God, the world is way too divided. Who needs to know about this? You have to recognize the reality is that the world is more divided than ever. And I began to realize, actually because of COVID, that you're absolutely right. But what COVID also taught us was actually how people came together to help each other. We also learned that there are little glimmers of things that people were paying attention to. That when India had the Delta variant raging high, why did 40 countries come together to help India out? Why was it that actually everybody was trying to figure out how we were going to try to deal with this together? So I will say that it's very, very true that the division that we see in the world is also precisely because, and lots of philosophers have written about this, is that it's actually the same coin, but the other side. It's precisely because the world is getting smaller, precisely because the world is more interconnected, that therefore it creates a threat. Because it is not possible today, the way it was maybe 100 years ago, to live in your own cocoon. You might say that social media actually allows you to create your own cocoon in different ways. But the reality is that today, 1 in every 5 person lives in the world in a place that they were not born in. And it will continue to grow. The climate crisis is going to force more people to move. It is continuing to, people are on the move, whether we like it or not. The social media, yes, it makes small places and smaller groups, but it also connects people in a much bigger way. So all of those are reality too. So my argument is that one reality is that the world is divided. The other reality is also that the world is getting closer and closer. We have to learn to live chick bajao. We haven't gotten the tools in our toolkit to do that. And what is brilliant about this phrase, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, is what would a functional family mean for you? We understand that. That within a family, you can be, as I said, you can be individual and you can be part of a group. I would argue that almost everywhere in the world today, we have forgotten a little bit about the relationship between the individual and the collective. And we have to think about the collective as much as we pay attention to the individual. It comes back to Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, I actually have done a lot of work in Iran. And one of the things you recognize is that there are going to be people who, for political reasons, it's for power more than anything else, they are going to fight hard to hold on to the small purchase they have. However, it also has to do with whether we respect them. Iranian people and even Iranian many officials are very smart, very thoughtful, but we don't give them that credit. So partly, as the Dalai Lama would say, are we actually giving compassion to others who are different from us? Then we can also ask them to do the same. But the bottom line, I would say, for me, is that, yes, this feels like an idealistic vision to treat the world as family, but we don't have a choice but to think about our independence in relation to the interdependence. Because climate crisis, the pandemics, everything you actually worry about that could destroy this universe and the planet does not know national borders. And we must also remember that the even idea of national and the nation state is less than 300 years old. It isn't something that's like cast in stone. And so if you go back to the full phrase that the Vasudeva Kutumbakam comes from, it actually says exactly what you said, that the ones of the limited mind only think of the blood relatives as their family. It is the magnanimous one who know that Vasudeva, that the world alone is family. And that, to me, suggests that they understood something, that we had to think of ourselves in this collective way. We haven't paid enough attention to that. We haven't trained our kids to do that. We don't pay enough attention to thinking about community, the collective, and the individual in it. So there's a lot of work to do. So we have a choice. Glass is maybe 3/4 empty in the negative sense and 1/4 full. Either you can make that glass at least half full or better than half full, or we simply said that's the way it is and let it be. But each one of us has a role to play.
Last question, Vishakha, and this is from Sunny Thacker. You touch in your book a lot about how you were disenchanted by museums and how you wanted to move into a role where you could have greater impact. Your last position was at Asia Society. I well remember a talk that you gave where you said that Asia Society in New York was probably the only place on earth where all the countries in Asia could actually come and talk and meet. And I was quite struck by that what is not possible inside Asia was possible on the other side of the globe. What do you think you are proudest of at Asia Society that actually implemented the philosophy of world as family that you would wish is multiplied in the years ahead?
There are things that I'm particularly proud of. It's not necessarily that it was directly related to the world as family. One of them is, but the other one is not. So, one is my attempt at really opening up the field of Asian art and to start doing contemporary art in a way that people were not doing yet, and to try to change the perception of Asia in America that when it came to culture, it was not all about the past, that the creativity was not the sole purview of the Euro American world, and that the creativity was live and alive and well in many, many parts of Asia. And I think that by doing some major, major projects, having it travel all over, really did make some difference. I would say it just so happened it was ahead of many other people. And to do first Asian American show in a big way, which was also to say that Asia is not just over there. Asia is right here in our midst. And that is not the same. And pay attention. The world as family concept, I would say for me, was most vividly manifested in the Asia 21, the Young Leaders program that we started. And I learned a lot from them. These were young people in Asia as well as in America. And we had never done anything like that because Asia Society was very big and big name policy people, you know all that. But we had not paid enough attention to the young leaders. And what I learned from them was that these young leaders, no matter where they were, in the Philippines, in Lahore, in India, in Nepal, they were really comfortable working across countries, across regions, and they were completely rooted. And they were doing some local work that was incredible, and they would get their help wherever they could find it. Part of it was that they were very communication savvy, and they connected with people from all different parts of the world. And that made me realize that actually it wasn't my role was not just to kind of be a bridge builder between Asia and America. Sounds already kind of highfalutin and big. But what we must do is to think about how do we situate ourselves in the world and begin to think about that so that now Asian society actually thinks of itself as being a place where you think about Asia in the world. And I think that you have to change and evolve. I mean, institutions have different needs and different kinds of trajectory. And so in my own little way, I would say those were the places that I hope I made some difference.
And you certainly did. I'll just say a few comments here and then let you have the last word. Vishakha, your book is not only very timely, but I would respectfully submit that Sapna's question about the Indian identity in America, the identity, hyphenated identity of Indo-Americans for the children, that you have actually provided the third answer, answer grounded in our cultural ethos. And that is that whether it is us, whether it is our children, as long as we are seen as a people for whom the world is family, that is where our safety lies. That is where our success lies. If every Indian is seen as the ambassador of the world is family, it'll be a beautiful world. And the way to start, folks who are watching this program, is, buy a copy of this book, read it, but then buy multiple copies of this book and gift it to your American friends. And by American, I mean everyone who is an American, whatever color, whatever immigrant nationality they came, because nothing explains what it is to be an Indian in America better than Vishakha Desai's book as to who we are as a people, what do we bring to this country, what will our children stand for. We are people who believe world as family. And I thank you, Vishakha. You have centered me, you have centered us back to the best that we are. And now I'll let you say the last word.
Thank you, Rajesh. You always have a way of wrapping things up. So I actually want to just simply say that I think for me, the book is not just about India or my Indianness or about being an Indian in America. I think that it is also about humanity. And a very dear Iranian American friend of mine said to me that, you may say all that, but it would not be possible except for the polyphonic, the kind of capacious Indian identity that the best of India has embodied. And I dare say that today we are forgetting that we are forgetting that the best of what India has to offer is that idea of multiplicity, whether it's multiplicity of gods, multiplicity of thought, multiplicity of religion. That is the strength, just as much as e pluribus unum is the motto of America. So, in a way, India and America are two countries that have a chance to actually say out of this multiplicity becomes a third space, and that third space is about being in the world. So let's just not forget that 99.9% of what we all have is our DNA is the same. And we're fighting over that small percentage that actually divides us. So I wish that with this book, it's really been an intention has been to be a catalyst for conversation and reflection. And if that can happen with the book, I really thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Indo-American Arts Council, for really organizing this wonderful, wonderful program. I am just deeply, deeply touched and honored.
Thank you. Thank you.